The sound of breaking glass never truly leaves you. It lives in your bones, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the moment before sleep takes hold. Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez knew this truth intimately as she pressed her back against the concrete wall of the abandoned pharmacy in Fallujah's Al-Anbar district, her breathing shallow and controlled despite the chaos erupting around her. The morning sun cast harsh shadows through the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving medical clinic. Dust motes danced in the amber light streaming through bullet holes that decorated the walls like deadly constellations. Maya's hands, steady despite everything, gripped her M4 carbine with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to make peace with violence. Her wedding ring, a simple gold band that had survived 3 deployments, caught the light as she adjusted her grip. "Rodriguez, what's your 20?" The voice crackled through her radio, distorted by static and the percussive thunder of mortar rounds landing 2 blocks away. Sergeant First Class Tommy Chen, her spotter and closest friend in this godforsaken place, sounded worried. He should be. They'd been separated for 23 minutes now, an eternity in combat time. Maya pressed the transmit button, her voice barely a whisper. "Pinned down at the pharmacy. Multiple contacts, eastern approach. They've got the whole block locked down." She paused, listening to the rhythmic chatter of Alaska 47 fire echoing off the narrow streets. "Tommy, they knew we were coming." The silence that followed her transmission stretched like a held breath. Through the shattered storefront, Maya could see the twisted remains of medical equipment. An examination table overturned like a metallic corpse, IV stands bent at impossible angles, prescription bottles scattered across the floor like fallen teeth. This place had once healed people, now it served as her potential tomb. Maya's mind drifted, as it often did in moments of extreme stress, to the letter she'd received from her younger sister Carmen just 3 days ago. Carmen was starting her residency at Johns Hopkins, following in their father's footsteps into medicine. The letter had been full of excitement about saving lives, about making a difference. Maya wondered what Carmen would think of this place, where the line between healing and killing had been obliterated by years of war. A movement in her peripheral vision snapped her back to the present. 3 insurgents were advancing through the rubble of the adjacent building, using the morning shadows as cover. Their movements were coordinated, professional. These weren't desperate amateurs driven by ideology alone. These were trained soldiers who understood urban warfare as intimately as she did. Maya's training kicked in with automatic precision. She identified cover points, calculated angles, assessed wind direction through the way dust particles moved in the shafts of sunlight. Her finger found the trigger guard of her rifle, and time seemed to slow to the consistency of honey. The first shot came not from her weapon, but from somewhere behind her. The distinctive crack of a sniper rifle echoed through the pharmacy, and one of the advancing insurgents dropped instantly. Maya spun around, confusion mixing with relief, but saw no one. The shot had come from an impossible angle, from a building that intelligence reports had declared empty. "Unknown shooter, identify yourself," she whispered into her radio, but received only static in response. The remaining 2 insurgents had taken cover, their advance halted but not stopped. Maya used the momentary reprieve to change her position, low-crawling behind the pharmacy counter where old medicine bottles crunched under her body armor like broken dreams. The smell of antiseptic still lingered in the air, a ghost of the building's former purpose. Maya's tactical vest contained the usual assortment of gear: extra magazines, medical supplies, her grandmother's rosary wrapped in electrical tape to prevent it from making noise. The rosary had been blessed by Father Martinez at St. Catherine's in El Paso before her first deployment. Her grandmother, Esperanza Rodriguez, had pressed it into Maya's hands with tears in her eyes and a fierce pride that spoke of generations of strong women who had sent their men and daughters off to war. A second sniper shot rang out, and the distinctive sound of a body hitting concrete followed immediately. Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Someone was out there, someone with exceptional skill, and she had no idea if they were friend or foe. Her radio crackled again. "Rodriguez, we're moving to your position." "Hold tight." Tommy's voice carried the strain of someone running while wearing 60 pounds of gear in 100-degree heat. "Negative," Maya responded quickly. "Unknown sniper in the area." Extremely accurate. Advise caution." She paused, then added, "Tommy, something's not right about this whole operation." The third insurgent had disappeared entirely, melting back into the urban maze with the practiced ease of someone who knew these streets as intimately as his own heartbeat. Maya waited, counting seconds, listening to the subtle sounds that would betray movement, the scrape of fabric against concrete, the soft crush of debris under boots, the metallic click of a safety being disengaged. Maya thought about her husband David, probably sitting in their kitchen in Fort Hood right now, drinking his morning coffee and reading the newspaper. He'd be wearing his faded University of Texas t-shirt, the one with the small hole near the left shoulder that she'd been threatening to throw away for 2 years. David was a mechanic with gentle hands and kind eyes who could fix anything except the distance that military service placed between them. The pharmacy's clock had stopped at 3:17, though whether AM or PM was impossible to determine. Maya wondered if that had been the moment when this building's purpose changed from healing to harboring, from hope to desperation. War had a way of freezing time in the most unexpected places, creating monuments to moments when everything changed forever. A new sound reached her ears, boots on gravel, multiple sets, moving with military precision. Maya's heart rate increased as she realized that her backup had arrived, but something about their approach pattern felt wrong, too coordinated, too silent. Her team moved with practiced efficiency, but this sounded different. This sounded like hunters who had found their prey. Through the pharmacy window, Maya caught sight of a reflection in a piece of broken mirror lodged in the window frame across the street. A figure in military fatigues was positioned on a rooftop, rifle trained in her direction. The uniform looked American, but something about the positioning, the patience, the absolute stillness, sent alarm bells ringing through her tactical awareness. Maya keyed her radio one more time. "Command, this is Rodriguez. Request immediate verification of all friendly forces in my sector. I've got unknown military personnel in the area, and I need to know if they're ours." The response came back within seconds, and it changed everything. "Rodriguez, negative on friendly forces in your sector. You and Chen's team are the only authorized personnel within a 2-click radius of your position." The realization hit Maya like a physical blow. Someone had been tracking them. Someone with access to their operational intelligence. Someone who knew exactly where they would be and when they would be there. The ambush hadn't been a coincidence. It had been a setup. Maya's mouth went dry as she processed the implications. The sniper who had saved her life moments ago wasn't part of her unit. The military personnel moving through the area weren't her backup. And somewhere in the chain of command that had authorized this mission, someone was playing a very different game than the one she thought she was playing. The wedding ring on her finger suddenly felt heavier, a reminder of everything she had to lose. Maya closed her eyes for just a moment, said a quick prayer to whatever deity might be listening in this forsaken place, and made a decision that would change the trajectory of her life forever. She was going to survive this, no matter what it took. And when she did, she was going to find out who had marked her for death and why. The sound of approaching footsteps grew closer, and Maya Rodriguez prepared to fight for her life against an enemy she couldn't identify, in a war that had just become far more personal than she had ever imagined possible. Maya's morning routine in the months before Fallujah had been as precise as her marksmanship. Wake at 05:00, exactly 15 minutes before her alarm. Kiss David's forehead while he slept, careful not to wake him. He worked late shifts at the base garage and needed the rest. Coffee black. No sugar. Standing at their kitchen window overlooking the modest base housing lawn, where Mrs. Patterson next door tended her impossible rose garden in the Texas heat. The roses bothered Maya more than she cared to admit. Not their beauty, but their defiance. How did something so delicate survive in such harsh conditions? Mrs. Patterson, a widow whose husband had died in Vietnam, spent every morning at dawn coaxing life from soil that should have yielded nothing but thorns and disappointment. Maya often wondered if there was a lesson in those roses, something about resilience she was supposed to understand but couldn't quite grasp. David would emerge from their bedroom around 06:30, hair disheveled, wearing whatever t-shirt he discarded the night before. He'd wrap his arms around her from behind, chin resting on her shoulder, and they'd stand together watching Mrs. Patterson work her magic. Neither of them spoke during these moments, Words felt unnecessary when the possibility of deployment hung over them like storm clouds that never quite broke into rain. "You think too much," David would whisper sometimes, his breath warm against her ear. "Just let things be beautiful without figuring out why." Maya's response was always the same, a slight lean into his embrace, a quiet sigh that carried the weight of all the things she couldn't say. How could she explain that her job required her to think constantly, to analyze threats, to see danger in every shadow? How could she tell him that beauty felt like a luxury she couldn't afford when people depended on her ability to make split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died? Her grandmother Esperanza had called every Sunday at exactly 1,400 hours, as if she had synchronized her schedule with military time zones out of respect for Maya's world. These conversations followed a familiar pattern: family news, neighborhood gossip, gentle inquiries about Maya's well-being that never quite masked the deeper worry in the old woman's voice. "Mija, you sound tired," Esperanza would say, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had worried about family members in uniform for decades. Maya's father had served in Desert Storm, her uncle in Vietnam, her great-grandfather in World War II. The Rodriguez family had a long tradition of service, and an equally long tradition of women who waited and worried and prayed. "Just busy, abuela," Maya would respond, sitting in the wooden chair David had built for their small balcony. "Training keeps me occupied." But Esperanza heard the things Maya didn't say. "Remember, Mija, strength isn't about carrying everything alone. Even the strongest buildings need foundations. Your family, we are your foundation." These conversations always ended the same way, with Esperanza making Maya promise to call if she needed anything at all, and Maya promising she would while knowing she never could. How do you call your grandmother from a war zone to say you're scared? How do you burden someone who has already given so much to the military with the knowledge that their granddaughter might not come home? Maya's relationship with her weapon was complicated in ways that civilian friends could never understand. Her M4 carbine was more than equipment. It was a trusted partner, an extension of her will, a tool that bridged the gap between intention and survival. She cleaned it with the same care other women might use applying makeup, understanding that this ritual meant the difference between life and death. During weapons maintenance, Maya's mind often wandered to her childhood in El Paso. Her father, Master Sergeant Roberto Rodriguez, had taught her to shoot when she was 12 years old, using an old .22 rifle that had belonged to his father. "Respect the weapon," he'd said, "and it will respect you. Fear it, and it becomes your enemy. Love it too much, and it becomes your god." Maya had never understood what he meant about loving a weapon too much, until she found herself in situations where her rifle was the only thing standing between her and death. There was a seductive comfort in its reliability, a dangerous temptation to believe that superior firepower could solve problems that required more nuanced solutions. Her relationship with Tommy Chen had developed over 18 months of training and deployment preparation. Tommy was a 24-year-old kid from San Francisco whose parents ran a small restaurant in Chinatown. He joined the Army to pay for college, planning to study engineering and build bridges instead of watching them get blown up. Tommy had a gift for finding humor in the darkest situations, a quality that had kept Maya sane during their previous deployment to Afghanistan. "You know what I miss most?" Tommy had asked her during a training exercise 3 weeks before Fallujah. They were lying prone on a hillside outside Fort Hood, practicing long-range reconnaissance, waiting for their target to appear. "Your mom's dumplings," Maya had responded without hesitation. Tommy talked about his mother's cooking the way other soldiers talked about women or cars or home. "Wrong," Tommy had said, surprising her. "I miss the sound of the cable cars. Not riding them, just hearing them in the distance when I'm trying to fall asleep. There's something about that sound that means everything's normal, you know, like the world's still turning the way it's supposed to." Maya had understood exactly what he meant. She missed the sound of David's breathing beside her in bed, the way it changed rhythm as he transitioned between sleep cycles. She missed the morning conversations with Mrs. Patterson over the fence, discussions about weather and roses that carried the comfortable weight of civilian concerns. She missed feeling like her biggest worry was whether to buy generic or name-brand cereal at the commissary. The night before deployment, Maya had found herself standing in their bedroom, watching David sleep. His face in repose looked younger than his 26 years, peaceful in a way that made her chest tight with protective instincts she couldn't express. She'd memorized the pattern of freckles across his shoulders, The way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the soft sound he made when he shifted positions. Maya had packed her deployment bag with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. Regulation uniforms, personal hygiene items, the small solar panel David had given her for charging electronic devices. Hidden in a pair of socks, she'd packed a photograph of the two of them from their wedding day, both grinning like idiots in front of the small chapel at Fort Hood. David was wearing his dress blues, Maya in a simple white dress she'd bought at a department store in Killeen. They looked impossibly young and confident, as if the future was something they could control through proper planning and good intentions. The letter from Carmen had arrived 2 days before the Fallujah mission, full of excitement about her residency program and stories about the attending physicians who were teaching her to save lives. Carmen wrote about procedures she was learning, patients whose conditions challenged her medical knowledge, the exhausting satisfaction of working 20-hour shifts in pursuit of healing. "I think about you constantly," Carmen had written in her careful handwriting. "Knowing you're out there protecting people while I'm learning to heal them makes me feel like we're part of something bigger, you know? Like we're both soldiers in different armies fighting the same war against suffering." Maya had read that letter 17 times, memorizing every word, finding comfort in her sister's naive optimism about the possibility of defeating suffering. Carmen saw the world in terms of problems that could be solved through proper diagnoses and treatment. Maya's world was full of problems that could only be managed through superior firepower and tactical advantage. The contradiction between their chosen professions had never felt more stark than during the pre-mission briefing for Fallujah. Colonel Marcus Webb had stood at the front of the briefing room, using a laser pointer to indicate key positions on a map that reduced a complex urban environment to colored lines and strategic objectives. Intelligence suggested insurgent activity in the medical district, he'd explained. Activities that threatened the stability of American operations in the region. Maya had stared at that map, thinking about Carmen's letters, about the pharmacy where she would soon find herself fighting for her life. Someone's clinic, someone's attempt to heal in a place where healing had become a dangerous act of defiance, was about to become a battlefield because politics and ideology had made medicine a weapon. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The irony wasn't lost on her that she would use her skills as a soldier to secure a medical facility so that other medics could continue their work. War had a way of creating such contradictions, forcing people to destroy in order to preserve, to kill in order to protect life. Maya's dreams in the weeks before deployment had been filled with roses, not Mrs. Patterson's carefully tended garden roses, but wild roses growing through concrete, thorny and impossible, and somehow beautiful in their refusal to accept the limitations of their environment. She'd wake from these dreams with a strange sense of anticipation, as if something important was waiting for her in Fallujah, something that would change her understanding of strength and survival, and what it meant to bloom in impossible places. Now, crouched behind the pharmacy counter with unknown snipers and fake allies closing in on her position, Maya realized that her dreams had been preparing her for this moment. She was the rose growing through concrete, thorny and dangerous and absolutely determined to survive despite the harsh conditions trying to crush her. The sound of footsteps was getting closer, and Maya Rodriguez prepared to discover just how deep her roots had grown in the unforgiving soil of warfare. The first bullet shattered the pharmacy's remaining intact window at 0847 hours, sending a cascade of glass fragments across the floor like deadly rain. Maya had been expecting it, counting down the seconds since she'd spotted the reflection of the sniper across the street. What she hadn't expected was the precision of the shot. It missed her head by exactly 3 inches, close enough to part her hair, deliberate enough to send a message. They wanted her alive. Maya rolled behind the overturned examination table, her mind racing through tactical possibilities. A sniper who wanted her dead wouldn't have missed from that distance. A sniper who wanted her alive was far more dangerous than one trying to kill her, because it meant this was about more than eliminating a threat. This was about extraction, interrogation, or worse. Her radio crackled with Tommy's voice, strained and urgent. "Rodriguez, I've got multiple contacts moving toward your position. Military fatigues, American weapons. But something's off about their formation. These guys aren't standard infantry." Maya pressed herself against the concrete wall, feeling the coolness seep through her tactical vest. "Tommy, listen to me carefully. This is not what we were briefed. Someone set us up, and I need you to get on the horn to command right now." Tell them we have hostile forces impersonating American military, and we need immediate extraction." The silence that followed her transmission stretched too long. When Tommy's voice came back, it carried a weight that made Maya's blood run cold. "Maya, I just talked to command. They say we're the only authorized personnel in this sector, but—" He paused, and she could hear the sound of automatic weapons fire in the background. "But they also said our mission parameters have changed. We're now under radio silence protocols until further notice." Maya felt the world shift beneath her like sand. Radio silence protocols meant they were on their own, cut off from support, operating in the dark without backup or extraction possibilities. But radio silence protocols were never implemented during active combat situations unless something had gone catastrophically wrong at the command level. A new voice cut through her earpiece, unfamiliar and speaking with the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, this is Colonel James Morrison, Special Operations Command. You are to lay down your weapons and surrender yourself to the personnel approaching your position. You are not in danger if you comply." Maya had never heard of Colonel Morrison, and his voice wasn't coming through normal communication channels. Someone had hacked their radio frequency, which meant they had access to military-grade equipment and technical expertise far beyond what typical insurgents possessed. "Negative unknown caller," Maya responded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "I do not recognize your authority, and I will not surrender my position to unidentified personnel." The response came immediately, and it changed everything. "Staff Sergeant, we have your husband David Rodriguez in custody at Fort Hood. We also have your sister Carmen Rodriguez at Johns Hopkins Medical Center under surveillance. Your compliance will ensure their continued safety." Maya's world collapsed into a single, crystal-clear moment of understanding. This wasn't about military operations or insurgent activities or securing medical facilities. This was about her, specifically her, and someone had been watching her family, studying her vulnerabilities, preparing to use the people she loved as leverage. The rage that filled Maya was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. It was cold and precise and absolutely lethal, the kind of anger that didn't cloud judgment but sharpened it to a razor's edge. Someone had made the catastrophic mistake of threatening her family, and they were about to discover why Maya Rodriguez had earned her reputation as one of the finest marksmen in the Army. Maya keyed her radio to Tommy's frequency. "Tommy, they've got David and Carmen. This is personal, not operational. Get out of here right now and contact real command through back channels. Tell them we have a compromise at the highest levels." Tommy's response was immediate and fierce. "Like hell I'm leaving you. We go together or we don't go at all." Through the shattered storefront, Maya could see figures moving with tactical precision through the rubble-strewn street. 6 men in American military fatigues, carrying M4 rifles and moving in formation patterns that looked correct but felt wrong. Their movements were too perfect, too choreographed, like actors who had studied military procedures but hadn't lived them. Maya counted ammunition, 4 full magazines plus the one currently loaded, approximately 120 rounds total. Against 6 trained operatives with unknown backup and sniper support, those rounds would have to count for everything. She thought about David, probably duct-taped to a chair in some anonymous building, confused and terrified and depending on her to save him. She thought about Carmen, brilliant and compassionate and completely unprepared for the reality that her sister's choices had put her in danger. The first operative reached the pharmacy entrance, and Maya's training took over with automatic precision. She waited until he was fully committed to entering the building, then put 2 rounds center mass. The man dropped instantly, but instead of the surprised shouts she expected from his teammates, Maya heard only calm tactical communications. "Target is active and accurate. Maintain perimeter. Do not advance until containment is complete." Maya realized with growing dread that they had expected her to resist. They had planned for casualties among their personnel. This wasn't a hasty operation thrown together by desperate criminals. This was a carefully orchestrated plan with backup procedures and acceptable loss calculations. A smoke grenade landed near the pharmacy counter, filling the space with thick gray clouds that burned Maya's eyes and throat. Through the smoke, she heard the distinctive whine of small drones, probably equipped with thermal imaging capabilities. They were mapping her position, preparing for a coordinated assault. Maya low-crawled toward the back of the pharmacy where a narrow doorway led to what had once been a storage room. The door was partially blocked by fallen debris, but she managed to squeeze through into a space barely large enough for one person. Medical supplies were scattered everywhere: bandages, antiseptic, pain medications that could have saved lives if they hadn't been abandoned when war made healing too dangerous to attempt. Her radio crackled again, this time with Tommy's voice whispering urgently, "Maya, I've got eyes on the building from the east. There are more than 6 guys out here. I count at least 12, maybe 15. And Maya, some of them are carrying body bags." The implication hit Maya like a physical blow. They weren't planning to take her alive after all. The threats against her family had been designed to make her surrender, to make her easier to capture and eliminate. The body bags meant they were prepared to dispose of evidence, to make Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez disappear without a trace. Maya thought about Mrs. Patterson's roses, about impossible beauty growing through concrete and thorns. She thought about Esperanza's weekly phone calls and the rosary wrapped in electrical tape in her tactical vest. She thought about David's gentle hands and Carmen's determination to heal the world, and all the futures that would be stolen if she didn't find a way to survive the next hour. A new sound reached her ears, the distinctive chop of helicopter rotors approaching from the north. Maya's heart leaped with the possibility of extraction, of real military support arriving to rescue her from this nightmare. But as the sound grew closer, she realized the timing was too convenient, too perfectly coordinated with the ground assault. These weren't her helicopters. These were theirs. Maya keyed her radio one final time, broadcasting on emergency frequencies that might reach someone, anyone, who could help her family even if they couldn't save her. "This is Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez, service number 547889921, currently under attack by unknown forces impersonating American military. My family has been threatened. David Rodriguez at Fort Hood and Carmen Rodriguez at Johns Hopkins Medical Center are in immediate danger. Request emergency protection and investigation of compromised command structure." The response came not through her radio but through a loudspeaker mounted on one of the approaching helicopters. The voice was the same one that had claimed to be Colonel Morrison, amplified now and carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, you have exactly 60 seconds to surrender before we demonstrate the consequences of non-compliance. Your husband David is watching this operation through live video feed. Your cooperation will determine whether he survives to see you again." Maya closed her eyes and said a prayer that was part plea for strength and part apology to everyone she was about to let down. When she opened them again, her vision was crystal clear, her hands steady, her mind focused on a single objective: survive long enough to save the people she loved and expose whoever was behind this betrayal. The storage room had a small window that faced west, probably designed to provide natural light for inventory management. Maya used the butt of her rifle to clear away the remaining glass, creating a firing position that would allow her to engage targets while maintaining cover. Through the window, Maya could see the helicopter landing in what had once been the clinic's parking lot. Men in black tactical gear were rappelling down ropes with professional efficiency, their movements coordinated by someone with extensive military training. These weren't insurgents or criminals or desperate opportunists. These were soldiers, American soldiers, following orders from someone high enough in the command structure to authorize an operation of this scope and complexity. Maya thought about the letter Carmen had written about fighting the same war against suffering from different armies. Now Maya understood that some wars were fought not between nations or ideologies, but between people who believed in protecting the innocent and people who believed the innocent were acceptable casualties in larger games of power and control. Tommy's voice crackled through her earpiece one last time, barely audible through the static and rotor noise. "Maya, whatever happens next, I want you to know you're the finest soldier I've ever served with. And Maya, I've been recording everything on backup channels. If something happens to us, people will know the truth." Maya felt a surge of love for the young man who had chosen to stay and fight beside her instead of saving himself. Tommy Chen, who missed the sound of cable cars and dreamed of building bridges, had risked everything to ensure that their story would survive even if they didn't. The 60 seconds were almost up, and Maya Rodriguez prepared to discover just how much punishment a rose could endure before its thorns drew blood from those trying to destroy it. The war was about to become very personal indeed. Maya counted 11 muzzle flashes through the pharmacy window before the first bullet found its mark. The shot caught her high in the left shoulder, spinning her around and slamming her against the storage room wall with enough force to knock the breath from her lungs. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but beneath it was something else. Surprise. She was still alive, still conscious, still capable of fighting back. The second bullet punched through her right thigh, missing the femoral artery by millimeters. Maya went down hard, her rifle clattering across the debris-strewn floor, but her mind remained sharp with the clarity that comes when death is close enough to smell. These weren't kill shots. These were carefully placed wounds designed to incapacitate without killing, to cause maximum pain while preserving her ability to answer questions. They wanted information, and they were willing to take her apart piece by piece to get it. Maya dragged herself behind a collapsed medical cabinet, leaving a trail of blood across pills and bandages that would never heal anyone. Her tactical vest had absorbed some of the impact, but she could feel warmth spreading beneath the Kevlar, where bullet fragments had found gaps in her armor. She pressed her field, dressing against the shoulder wound, gritting her teeth against pain that threatened to overwhelm her tactical awareness. Through the ringing in her ears, Maya heard boots crunching through glass and debris as the assault team entered the pharmacy. Their movements were methodical, professional, coordinated by hand signals and whispered communications that spoke of extensive training and combat experience. "Target is down but mobile," a voice reported. "Bleeding but not critical. Maintain containment and prepare for extraction." Maya's radio was still functional, and Tommy's voice cut through the static with desperate urgency. "Maya, they've got the building surrounded, but I've been monitoring their communications. These guys aren't just rogue military, they're private contractors. Corporate logo on their equipment says Blackwater Solutions." The revelation hit Maya harder than the bullets had. Blackwater was a private military corporation that operated in legal gray areas, conducting operations too sensitive or controversial for official military units. If Blackwater was involved, it meant someone with serious money and political connections had authorized her elimination. But why? What could a staff sergeant from El Paso possibly know that would justify this level of resource expenditure and risk? Maya's shoulder wound was bleeding steadily, but she managed to retrieve her sidearm, a Beretta M9 that had been her father's weapon during Desert Storm. The familiar weight of the pistol in her hands connected her to generations of Rodriguez family members who had faced impossible odds and somehow found ways to survive. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," the loudspeaker voice echoed through the pharmacy. "You have demonstrated exceptional resilience, but continued resistance will only increase your suffering. We need to discuss certain documents that came into your possession during your previous deployment to Afghanistan." Maya's mind raced backward through 18 months of memories, searching for any document or intelligence that could explain why she was bleeding in a Fallujah pharmacy while private contractors threatened her family. Afghanistan had been a relatively quiet deployment, routine patrols, checkpoint security, liaison work with local military units. Nothing that should have attracted the attention of corporate interests. A third bullet shattered the medical cabinet above her head, sending a shower of glass and splinters across her position. This shot was closer, more accurate, designed to force her to move. Maya realized they were hurting her, using precise fire to drive her toward a specific location where extraction would be easier. Maya thought about the letters she'd written to David and Carmen but never sent, letters full of fears and doubts and love that felt too big for words. She thought about Mrs. Patterson's roses and Esperanza's weekly phone calls, and all the ordinary moments that had seemed insignificant until they were about to be lost forever. "Tommy," she whispered into her radio, "whatever happens, make sure my family knows I died fighting. Don't let them think I went easy." Tommy's response came immediately, fierce and determined. "You're not dying today, Maya. I won't let you." The sound of movement behind her made Maya spin around, weapon raised, only to see Tommy Chen sliding through the storage room window, with his rifle ready and his face set in lines of grim determination. Blood was streaming from a gash across his forehead and his left arm hung at an awkward angle, but his eyes were clear and focused. "What the hell are you doing?" Maya hissed. "I told you to get out of here." "Yeah, well, I've never been good at following orders," Tommy replied, taking position beside her. "Besides, someone needs to watch your six while you figure out why Blackwater wants you dead." Maya felt a surge of emotion that had nothing to do with pain or fear and everything to do with the kind of loyalty that couldn't be bought or commanded or faked. Tommy Chen had risked everything to stay beside her, and his presence transformed her from an isolated target into part of a team again. A fourth bullet punched through Maya's left leg, just below the knee, and she went down hard with a cry she couldn't suppress. The pain was excruciating, but worse than the physical damage was the realization that she was running out of mobility options. Each wound was calculated to reduce her combat effectiveness while keeping her alive for interrogation. "Maya," Tommy's voice was sharp with concern and rage. "That's it. I'm done playing defense." Before Maya could stop him, Tommy raised his rifle and began laying down suppressive fire through the storage room window. His shots were precise and deadly, forcing the Blackwater operatives to take cover and buying them precious seconds to reposition. During the brief respite, Maya's memory finally connected the dots. Afghanistan, 18 months ago, a routine patrol that had discovered an abandoned compound near the Pakistani border. Inside that compound, she'd found documents written in English that detailed weapons shipments, financial transfers, and operational plans that suggested American military equipment was being diverted to insurgent groups. Maya had followed protocol, turning the documents over to intelligence officers who had assured her they would be properly investigated. She'd assumed the materials would disappear into the bureaucratic machinery of military intelligence, filed away and forgotten like thousands of other pieces of battlefield debris. But what if those documents had contained information that could embarrass or implicate powerful people? What if the weapons transfers had been authorized by officials who needed those transactions to remain secret? What if Maya Rodriguez, by doing her job and following regulations, had accidentally uncovered evidence of treason at the highest levels of American government? A fifth bullet found Maya's right arm, spinning her around and sending her weapon flying across the storage room. She was down to her backup sidearm and whatever ammunition Tommy could provide, facing professional killers who had unlimited resources and official sanction for their actions. "Tommy," Maya gasped, "the documents from Afghanistan. Someone's covering up weapons transfers to insurgents. That's why they want me dead." Tommy's eyes widened with understanding and horror. "Maya, if that's true, then this goes all the way to the top. We're not just fighting Blackwater. We're fighting people who control Blackwater." A new voice cut through their tactical communications, speaking with the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, you have correctly identified the nature of your situation. The documents you discovered in Afghanistan contain information that could destabilize American operations throughout the Middle East. Your silence has been purchased with your life and the lives of your family members." Maya felt a cold fury that burned away pain and fear and doubt. These people had threatened David and Carmen not because of anything her family had done, but because Maya had been an honest soldier who followed regulations and trusted the system to do the right thing. The sixth bullet caught Maya in the abdomen, punching through her tactical vest and doubling her over with agony that felt like being hit by a sledgehammer. Blood began pooling beneath her, warm and sticky and far too much for someone who planned to survive the next hour. But Maya Rodriguez had never been someone who accepted defeat gracefully. "Listen to me very carefully," the voice continued through the loudspeaker. "You have information in your possession that you don't even realize you have. During your debriefing after the Afghanistan discovery, you were shown photographs and asked to identify individuals in surveillance footage. One of those individuals was Senator Patricia Harrison, chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Another was General Robert Caldwell, who oversees weapons procurement for the entire Middle Eastern theater." Maya's vision was starting to gray around the edges, but her mind was crystal clear. She remembered that debriefing, remembered the intelligence officers showing her grainy photographs of people in civilian clothes meeting with known arms dealers. She'd identified the faces she could recognize, assuming she was helping with counterintelligence operations designed to protect American interests. Instead, she'd been documenting evidence of the highest levels of American government selling weapons to the very insurgents who were killing American soldiers. The seventh bullet shattered Maya's left elbow, and she screamed despite her determination to stay silent. Tommy was beside her instantly, applying pressure to her wounds and whispering reassurances that they both knew were lies. Maya was dying, bleeding out in a storage room full of medical supplies that might as well have been on the moon for all the good they could do. "Maya," Tommy said urgently, "I've been recording everything. The voices, the threats, the admission about the documents. If we can get this information out, we can expose the whole conspiracy. Maya managed a weak smile. Tommy Chen, who joined the army to pay for college and dreamed of building bridges, had become the most important soldier in the world without even realizing it. His recordings could bring down senators and generals and save countless lives by exposing the truth about American weapons ending up in enemy hands. The eighth bullet punched through Maya's right shoulder, pinning her against the wall with an impact that drove the breath from her lungs. She could feel her strength ebbing with each heartbeat, feel death approaching with the inevitable certainty of sunrise. But Maya Rodriguez wasn't done fighting yet. "Tommy," she whispered, "get the recording to my sister Carmen. Tell her to contact investigative journalists, military ethics boards, anyone who will listen. Tell her Maya Rodriguez died trying to protect American soldiers from their own government." The ninth bullet found Maya's left thigh, missing major arteries but adding to the catastrophic blood loss that was shutting down her systems one by one. Through the gathering darkness, Maya could hear the Blackwater operatives discussing extraction procedures, timing windows, cleanup protocols. "Target is nearly expired," one voice reported. "Estimated 2 to 3 minutes until cardiac arrest. Prepare for body retrieval and evidence sanitization." Tommy was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he tried desperately to stop bleeding from wounds that were too numerous and too severe for field treatment. "Maya, don't you dare die on me. Don't you dare leave me alone with this." Maya reached up with her remaining functional hand and touched Tommy's face, leaving a bloody handprint on his cheek that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. "Promise me," she whispered. "Promise me you'll get the truth out. Promise me their deaths won't be for nothing." "I promise," Tommy said, his voice breaking. "I swear to God, Maya, I'll make them pay for this." The 10th bullet was the worst yet, punching through Maya's pelvis and sending shock waves of agony through her entire body. She could taste blood in her mouth now, could feel her heartbeat becoming irregular and weak, but beneath the pain was something else, a fierce satisfaction that came from knowing the truth would survive even if she didn't. Maya thought about David, probably still tied to a chair somewhere, waiting for news about whether his wife would come home alive. She thought about Carmen, brilliant and compassionate and completely unprepared for the knowledge that her sister had died protecting strangers from the corruption of their own leaders. She thought about Mrs. Patterson's roses, growing through concrete and proving that beauty could survive anywhere if it was strong enough and stubborn enough to refuse surrender. Ichidursus. The 11th bullet entered Maya's chest just below her heart, and she knew with absolute certainty that this was the end. Her vision was fading, her breathing becoming shallow and irregular, her grip on consciousness slipping away like sand through fingers. But as darkness closed around her, Maya Rodriguez heard something that changed everything. The sound of real helicopters approaching from the south. Helicopters with transponder codes that belonged to her actual unit, not to Blackwater contractors or corrupt officials or anyone else who wanted her dead. Tommy's recordings had reached someone who believed in the truth. Help was coming, justice was possible, and Maya Rodriguez had survived long enough to ensure that her sacrifice would mean something. Through the loudspeaker, the voice that had claimed to be Colonel Morrison was shouting orders to abort the operation and withdraw immediately. The sound of boots running across concrete told Maya that the Blackwater operatives were fleeing, abandoning their mission rather than face questions from legitimate military authority. Maya felt Tommy's hands on her face, felt him checking her pulse and breathing. "Maya, Maya, stay with me." "The cavalry's here, we made it, you crazy, stubborn woman. We actually made it." Maya tried to respond, tried to tell Tommy that he was the real hero in this story, that his courage and loyalty had saved not just her life but potentially thousands of lives by exposing the weapons conspiracy. But her voice was gone, her strength exhausted, her body shutting down despite her will to continue fighting. As she slipped into unconsciousness, Maya Rodriguez knew with absolute certainty that she had kept faith with everyone who mattered, her family, her fellow soldiers, her country, and herself. The truth would survive, justice would be served, and David and Carmen would know that Maya had died as she had lived, protecting others from those who would do them harm. The last thing Maya heard before darkness claimed her was Tommy's voice on the radio, broadcasting to the incoming helicopters. "This is Sergeant Chen with wounded personnel requiring immediate medical evacuation. Be advised we have evidence of high-level conspiracy involving weapons transfers and assassination attempts against American military personnel. Maya Rodriguez closed her eyes and dreamed of roses growing through concrete, beautiful and impossible and absolutely unstoppable. Maya Rodriguez opened her eyes to the antiseptic smell of a hospital room and the steady beeping of machines monitoring her vital signs. The ceiling was white and clean, a stark contrast to the debris-covered pharmacy floor where she'd nearly bled to death 6 weeks earlier. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there, but then the memories came flooding back with painful clarity. Fallujah. 11 bullets. Tommy's tears. The truth about weapons transfers and corrupt officials who had tried to silence her permanently. "She's awake," a familiar voice said from somewhere near the window. Maya turned her head slowly, fighting waves of dizziness, and saw David sitting in a chair beside her bed. Her husband looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past month and a half, with new lines around his eyes and gray in his hair that hadn't been there before deployment. "Hey there, beautiful," David said softly, reaching for her hand. "Welcome back to the land of the living." Maya tried to speak but found her throat raw and dry. David noticed immediately, offering her ice chips from a cup on the bedside table. The cold felt like heaven against her parched mouth, and gradually she found her voice. "Tommy?" she managed to whisper. "He's fine," David assured her quickly. "Bruised and battered, but nothing that won't heal. More importantly, he's been busy. Maya, what you two did, it's changed everything." Over the next hour, David and Carmen, who had flown in from Baltimore the moment she'd received word about Maya's condition, filled her in on the aftermath of Fallujah. Tommy's recordings had reached Colonel Sarah Martinez, Maya's actual commanding officer, who had immediately recognized the voices on the tape and understood the implications of what they were hearing. Within 12 hours of Maya's medical evacuation, FBI agents had arrested Senator Patricia Harrison at her home in Virginia and General Robert Caldwell at the Pentagon. The weapons transfer documents Maya had discovered in Afghanistan had been authenticated, revealing a conspiracy that stretched across multiple government agencies and private military contractors. "The story broke 3 days ago," Carmen said, holding up a newspaper with Maya's photograph on the front page. The headline read, "Soldier's Courage Exposes Pentagon Corruption Scandal." Below it, in smaller text, "Staff Sergeant Survives Assassination Attempt. Evidence Leads to High-Level Arrests." Maya stared at the photograph, a military portrait taken before her deployment, showing her in dress uniform with ribbons and decorations that seemed to belong to someone else's life. The woman in that photograph looked young and confident, untouched by the knowledge that her own government might try to kill her for doing her job too well. "There's more," David said gently. "The president ordered a full investigation into military contractor operations worldwide. Blackwater's contracts have been suspended pending review, and Maya, you're being awarded the Medal of Honor." Maya felt tears welling up in her eyes, but they weren't tears of joy or pride. They were tears of grief for the innocence she'd lost, for the simple faith in institutions that had been shot away along with pieces of her body in that Fallujah pharmacy. "What about the families of soldiers who died because of those weapons?" Maya asked quietly. "What about the people who were killed by American equipment that was supposed to protect them?" Carmen leaned forward, her medical training evident in the way she checked Maya's pulse and breathing even while they talked. "That's what the investigation is for, Maya. Every weapons transfer is being reviewed, every suspicious death re-examined. Your courage is going to save lives, maybe thousands of them." Over the following weeks, as Maya's body slowly healed and her strength gradually returned, she learned more about the scope of the conspiracy she'd inadvertently exposed. The weapons transfers had been ongoing for 3 years, generating millions of dollars in illegal profits, while American soldiers faced enemies equipped with their own government's equipment. Tommy visited regularly, bringing news from the ongoing investigation and updates on the prosecution of those involved. He'd been promoted to staff sergeant and recommended for the Bronze Star for his actions in Fallujah, but Tommy seemed more interested in discussing his plans for after-military service. "I've been accepted to MIT," he told Maya during one visit, his face bright with excitement that reminded her of the young man who'd missed San Francisco cable cars. "Full scholarship engineering program. I want to build things that help people instead of destroy them." Maya smiled, thinking about the bridges Tommy would design and construct, structures that would connect communities and last for generations. Tommy Chen had earned the right to build beautiful things with his hands, to create instead of destroy, to prove that hope could triumph over violence and corruption. The Medal of Honor ceremony took place at the White House on a crisp October morning, with Maya's extended family in attendance and media coverage that transformed her from an unknown soldier into a national symbol of integrity and courage. President Morrison, no relation to the fake colonel whose voice had threatened her in Fallujah, placed the medal around her neck and spoke about the importance of soldiers who chose to do the right thing even when it cost them everything. Maya stood at attention during the ceremony, her body still bearing the scars of 11 bullet wounds, her mind still processing the trauma of discovering that her own government had tried to kill her. But beneath the pain and confusion was something else, a quiet pride in having kept faith with the values she'd sworn to uphold when she first put on the uniform. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. After the ceremony, Maya found herself standing alone on the White House lawn, holding the medal and thinking about Mrs. Patterson's roses. The old woman had sent a letter while Maya was recovering, telling her that the rose garden had bloomed more beautifully than ever that summer, as if drawing strength from Maya's example of surviving impossible conditions. "The roses know what you did," Mrs. Patterson had written in her careful handwriting. "They know that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the hardest ground, watered with tears and fed with courage." David appeared beside her, as he always did when she needed him most. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Maya nodded, then shook her head, then laughed at her own confusion. "I don't know how to feel about being a hero for almost getting killed by my own side." "You're a hero for refusing to stay silent," David replied firmly. "You're a hero for protecting soldiers you'll never meet from weapons that should never have been in enemy hands. You're a hero for trusting Tommy to tell the truth even when you thought you were dying." Maya thought about the letters she'd written but never sent, the fears and doubts and love that had seemed too big for words. Now those feelings had been transformed into something larger, a story of courage and sacrifice that would inspire other soldiers to speak truth to power, regardless of the personal cost. Carmen joined them on the lawn, her medical bag slung over her shoulder even though she was technically off duty. "How are you feeling, physically?" she asked, her professional concern evident in the way she studied Maya's posture and breathing. "Like I got shot 11 times, Maya replied with dry humor that made both David and Carmen laugh. "But alive, definitely alive." Carmen smiled, the expression transforming her serious face into something radiant. "Maya, there's something I need to tell you. I've been accepted into a trauma surgery residency program. Specifically, I want to work with wounded veterans, to help soldiers who've been injured in combat." Maya felt a surge of emotion that had nothing to do with her physical pain. Carmen had chosen to dedicate her medical career to healing people like Maya, to using her skills in service of those who had sacrificed for others. The Rodriguez family tradition of service would continue, but in a form that built up instead of tearing down. "That's perfect," Maya said softly. "You'll save lives that need saving, help people who deserve help." "I learned it from watching you," Carmen replied. "You showed me what real courage looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what's right, even when you're terrified." As they stood together on the White House lawn, Maya Rodriguez understood that her story was far from over. The bullets had healed, the conspiracy had been exposed, justice was being served. But the real legacy of Fallujah wasn't in the Medal of Honor around her neck or the headlines that had made her famous. The real legacy was in Tommy's acceptance to MIT, where he would build bridges that connected communities. It was in Carmen's decision to heal wounded warriors with the same dedication Maya had shown in protecting them. It was in the thousands of soldiers who would serve with integrity, because Maya Rodriguez had proven that truth was worth defending, even at the cost of everything. Maya thought about the roses growing through concrete, about impossible beauty that refused to be destroyed by harsh conditions. She thought about Esperanza's weekly phone calls, and the rosary wrapped in electrical tape that had somehow survived 11 bullets in a firefight with private military contractors. Most of all, she thought about the future, a future where American soldiers could trust their leaders, where weapons stayed in the right hands, where courage was rewarded instead of punished. That future was possible, Because Maya Rodriguez had refused to die quietly in a Fallujah pharmacy. Because Tommy Chen had stayed to record the truth. Because sometimes the most important battles were fought not against foreign enemies but against the corruption within. Truer. Maya Rodriguez, Medal of Honor recipient, survivor of 11 gunshots, and protector of American soldiers everywhere, was ready to help build that future, one honest choice at a time. 3 years later, Maya Rodriguez stood at the podium of the Virginia Military Institute, looking out at 250 cadets whose faces reflected the same eager determination she had once possessed. The auditorium was silent, except for the subtle rustle of dress uniforms and the distant sound of cadets drilling on the parade ground outside. Integrity, Maya began, her voice carrying easily through the space, is not about following orders, it's about knowing which orders deserve to be followed. The cadets leaned forward slightly, recognizing that they were about to hear something that wouldn't be found in any field manual or regulation handbook. Maya had been invited to speak about leadership and ethics, but she knew these young men and women needed to understand the weight of the oath they would soon take. 3 years ago, I discovered documents that revealed American weapons were being sold to insurgents who were killing American soldiers. I followed protocol, turned in the evidence, and trusted the system to do the right thing. Maya paused, letting the implications sink in. The system tried to have me killed for it. Behind Maya, a PowerPoint slide displayed the now famous photograph of the Fallujah pharmacy where she'd nearly bled to death. Bullet holes dotted the walls like deadly constellations, and bloodstains were still visible on the concrete floor where she'd made her stand. I want you to understand something, Maya continued, her voice growing stronger. The greatest threat to American soldiers isn't enemy bullets or roadside bombs. It's the corruption of leaders who put profit and politics ahead of the lives they're sworn to protect. In the audience, Maya spotted Tommy Chen in his civilian clothes, now a senior at MIT, where he was designing earthquake-resistant bridges for developing countries. Tommy caught her eye and nodded slightly, a gesture that carried the weight of shared trauma and triumph. Maya had invited Tommy to every speaking engagement, wanting cadets to see that heroism came in many forms. Tommy's decision to stay and record the truth had been just as crucial as Maya's willingness to fight 11-to-1 odds against private military contractors. The Medal of Honor around my neck isn't for getting shot, Maya said, touching the ribbon that had become both blessing and burden. It's for refusing to let those shots silence the truth. Every one of you will face moments when doing the right thing costs more than you want to pay. In those moments, remember that your oath is to the Constitution and the American people, not to any individual leader or personal interest. After the presentation, Maya found herself surrounded by cadets, asking questions that revealed both their idealism and their growing understanding of the complexities they would soon face. A young woman from Texas asked about the weapons transfer investigation. A cadet from California wanted to know how to identify corruption in the chain of command. A quiet young man from Maine asked how Maya had found the courage to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless. Courage isn't something you find, Maya replied to the last question. It's something you choose again and again, especially when you're terrified. I was scared every second in that pharmacy. But I had people depending on me, my family, soldiers I'd never met, future generations who deserved better than what they were getting. 5 years later, Dr. Carmen Rodriguez finished her final suture on a Marine Corps sergeant whose legs had been shattered by an IED in Syria. The surgery had taken 8 hours, requiring multiple skin grafts and bone reconstruction, but the young Marine would walk again. More importantly, he would return to his family whole and functional. Carmen stepped back from the operating table, pulling off her surgical gloves and mask, feeling the familiar exhaustion that came after complex trauma surgery. Through the observation window, she could see the sergeant's parents waiting in the recovery room, their faces etched with worry and hope in equal measure. Dr. Rodriguez? One of her residents approached with a tablet displaying the next case. We have incoming trauma from Afghanistan. Multiple gunshot wounds, currently stable but requiring immediate surgery. Carmen nodded, already reviewing the medical charts and surgical options. This was her life now. 16-hour days in trauma surgery, working to repair bodies broken by warfare, giving families back the people they thought they'd lost forever. The inspiration for her career choice was never far from her mind. Maya's example of surviving 11 gunshots and using that survival to protect others, had shown Carmen that healing could be its own form of heroism. Every soldier she saved was a victory against the forces that tried to destroy rather than build up. On her office wall hung a photograph of Maya receiving the Medal of Honor, flanked by pictures of the soldiers Carmen had helped heal over the past 5 years. 63 successful trauma surgeries, 63 families reunited with their loved ones, 63 lives saved by skills learned in pursuit of honoring her sister's sacrifice. Carmen's work had attracted national attention, leading to innovations in battlefield medicine and improved trauma protocols that were saving lives worldwide. Medical schools were using her techniques in their curricula, and military hospitals had adopted her patient care standards as the gold standard for treating wounded warriors. But the real measure of her success wasn't in awards or recognition. It was in the letters she received from families whose loved ones had come home because of her surgical skills. It was in the children who would grow up with fathers and mothers who might have died without Carmen's intervention. 7 years later, Tommy Chen stood on the Golden Gate Bridge, watching morning fog roll across San Francisco Bay while conducting a final inspection of his latest project. The bridge renovation had taken 3 years and incorporated seismic engineering techniques he'd developed specifically for earthquake-prone regions. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now building structures designed to withstand the kind of violent shaking that had once characterized his life as a soldier. But unlike the destruction he'd witnessed in Fallujah, Tommy's bridges were built to last, to connect communities, to prove that human ingenuity could triumph over natural disaster. His engineering firm, Chen Bridge Solutions, had completed projects in California, Japan, Chile, and Nepal, all regions where earthquakes threatened to isolate communities and disrupt lives. Each bridge was a testament to the power of construction over destruction, hope over despair, connection over isolation. Tommy carried Maya's Medal of Honor citation in his wallet, not as a memento, but as a reminder of the responsibility that came with survival. Maya had lived through 11 gunshots so that truth could triumph over corruption. Tommy had survived Fallujah so that he could build things that would outlast wars and serve communities for generations. His latest project was a pedestrian bridge in San Francisco's Mission District, designed to connect a low-income neighborhood with a new medical center. The bridge featured earthquake-resistant design, aesthetic elements that celebrated the community's cultural heritage, and accessibility features for disabled residents. Standing on the Golden Gate Bridge, Tommy could see his creation taking shape in the distance, cables and steel forming graceful curves that would soon carry thousands of people safely across a geographic divide that had separated communities for decades. Tommy thought about the cable car sounds he'd missed during deployment, the mechanical rhythm that had meant home and safety and normalcy. Now he was creating his own version of that sound, the quiet hum of traffic crossing bridges he'd designed, the footsteps of pedestrians using walkways he'd engineered, the subtle vibrations of structures that would outlast their creator and serve people he would never meet. 10 years later, Maya Rodriguez walked through Arlington National Cemetery on a crisp autumn morning, carrying a wreath of roses from Mrs. Patterson's garden. The old woman had passed away the previous spring, but not before ensuring that someone would continue tending her impossible roses that grew through concrete and thrived in harsh conditions. Maya made this pilgrimage every year on the anniversary of Fallujah, not to honor her own survival, but to remember the soldiers who hadn't made it home from wars, complicated by corruption and betrayal. The weapons transfer scandal had been fully exposed, trials had been completed, justice had been served. But justice couldn't resurrect the dead or heal families torn apart by preventable losses. She stopped at the grave of Master Sergeant Robert Kim, killed by an IED made from American ordnance that had been sold to insurgents through the same conspiracy Maya had exposed. Kim had left behind a wife and 2 daughters who were now in college, studying engineering and medicine respectively. Maya placed the roses on Kim's grave and stood in silence for several minutes, thinking about the ripple effects of individual choices. Her decision to follow protocol and report suspicious documents had nearly cost her life, but it had also prevented countless other deaths by shutting down the weapons transfers. From her position on the hill, Maya could see the Pentagon in the distance, its massive walls hiding the thousands of people who worked every day to protect American interests around the world. Most of those people were honest patriots doing difficult jobs under impossible circumstances. But a few were not, and Maya's experience had taught her that vigilance against corruption was as important as vigilance against foreign enemies. Maya's phone buzzed with a text message from Carmen. "Just finished surgery on another wounded warrior. He's going to be fine. Thank you for showing me what courage looks like." A second message came from Tommy. "Bridge inspection complete. All systems green. This one will last 1,000 years. Thanks for teaching me that some things are worth building." Maya smiled, feeling the weight of the Medal of Honor around her neck and the warmth of autumn sunlight on her face. She thought about Mrs. Patterson's roses, growing wild now in the abandoned garden but somehow more beautiful for their independence. She thought about David, who had retired from the army to become a high school teacher, inspiring young people to serve their communities in ways that built up rather than tore down. Most of all, she thought about the future, a future where soldiers could trust their leaders, where weapons stayed in the right hands, where courage was rewarded instead of punished. That future was closer now, because Maya Rodriguez had refused to die quietly in a Fallujah pharmacy, because Tommy Chen had stayed to record the truth, because Carmen Rodriguez had dedicated her life to healing those broken by war. Maya Rodriguez, Medal of Honor recipient, survivor of 11 gunshots, and guardian of military integrity, walked through Arlington National Cemetery, knowing that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost. The roses growing through concrete had taught her that beauty and strength could flourish anywhere, even in the harshest conditions, especially when watered with courage and fed with truth. 15 years later, the Maya Rodriguez Institute for Military Ethics opened its doors on a campus in Colorado Springs, funded by a combination of government grants and private donations from families whose loved ones had been saved by Maya's courage. The Institute's mission was simple: train military leaders to recognize and resist corruption, ensuring that future generations of soldiers would serve with integrity and honor. Maya stood in the Institute's main auditorium, looking at photographs of the first graduating class, 200 officers from all branches of the military who had completed intensive training in ethics, transparency, and moral leadership. These officers would return to their units, carrying the tools and knowledge necessary to prevent the kind of corruption that had nearly killed Maya in Fallujah. The Institute's curriculum included case studies from Maya's experience, Tommy's recordings, and the subsequent investigation that had exposed the weapons transfer conspiracy. But it also included positive examples of leaders who had chosen integrity over expediency, courage over comfort, truth over political convenience. Carmen served on the Institute's medical advisory board, developing protocols for identifying and treating combat stress that might compromise ethical decision-making. Her research had shown that soldiers under extreme stress were more susceptible to corruption and more likely to make choices that violated their core values. Tommy had designed the Institute's buildings to last centuries, incorporating the same earthquake-resistant techniques he'd perfected in his bridge construction. The architecture itself was a statement of purpose. These buildings would stand as monuments to integrity long after their creators were gone. On the wall of Maya's office hung a photograph of Mrs. Patterson's roses, now growing wild across the entire yard of the abandoned house in Fort Hood. The roses had proven that beauty could survive anywhere, even without human care, especially when their roots ran deep enough to find strength in unexpected places. Maya thought about the young cadets who would graduate from this institute and return to military units around the world. They would face moments when doing the right thing cost more than they wanted to pay. In those moments, they would remember Maya Rodriguez, who had survived 11 gunshots, to prove that truth was worth defending. The Institute's motto, carved in granite above the main entrance, captured everything Maya had learned from her experience: integrity under fire. Below it, in smaller letters, was a quote that had become Maya's personal philosophy. Some battles are won not by those who fight hardest, but by those who refuse to surrender what they believe. 20 years later, Maya Rodriguez sat in her garden, watching her daughter Elena practice marksmanship with the same .22 rifle that Maya's father had used to teach her to shoot decades earlier. Elena was 12 years old, serious and focused, with David's gentle eyes and Maya's stubborn determination to excel at whatever she attempted. "Remember what Grandpa Roberto taught me," Maya called out, "and what I'm teaching you. Respect the weapon and it will respect you. The goal isn't to be the best shot in the world. The goal is to understand responsibility. Elena nodded without taking her eyes off the target, adjusting her breathing and grip with the careful precision of someone who understood that excellence required patience and practice. She squeezed the trigger gently, and the shot rang true, hitting the bullseye with satisfying accuracy. Maya felt pride mixed with apprehension as she watched her daughter master skills that might someday be needed for purposes Maya hoped would never arise. Elena lived in a world made safer by her mother's sacrifices, but it was still a world where good people sometimes needed to be prepared for violence. David emerged from the house carrying glasses of lemonade and wearing the same faded University of Texas t-shirt that Maya had been threatening to throw away for 20 years. His hair was completely gray now, and his hands showed the wear of decades working with tools and engines, but his eyes still held the kindness that had attracted Maya from their first meeting. "How's our little Annie Oakley doing?" David asked, settling into the chair beside Maya. "She's got your patience and my stubbornness," Maya replied, watching Elena reload with careful deliberation. "God help us all." David laughed, the sound carrying across the yard where Mrs. Patterson's roses had spread to cover an entire hillside. The roses bloomed in impossible profusion, fed by Colorado mountain soil and watered by afternoon thunderstorms that swept across the peaks with dramatic regularity. Maya's phone buzzed with a message from Tommy, now a professor at MIT, who consulted on infrastructure projects around the world. The message included a photograph of his latest bridge, spanning a river in Bangladesh and connecting communities that had been separated by seasonal flooding for generations. "Another bridge for the collection," the message read. "This one serves 50,000 people. Thanks for teaching me that some things are worth building." Carmen's message arrived a few minutes later, sent from a medical conference in Germany, where she was presenting research on treating psychological trauma in combat veterans. "Just gave a lecture on resilience to 500 doctors from 30 countries. Your story is still inspiring people to choose healing over harm." Maya looked at the messages and felt the familiar mixture of pride and humility that came with knowing her experience had rippled outward in ways she could never have imagined. Elena's careful target practice, Tommy's bridges connecting communities, Carmen's surgical skills saving lives. All of these were part of a legacy that had begun with 11 bullets in a Fallujah pharmacy. Elena finished her practice session and jogged back to the porch, her face flushed with excitement and accomplishment. "Mom, I hit the bullseye 7 times out of 10. Grandpa Roberto would be proud, right?" Maya hugged her daughter, thinking about the grandfather Elena had never met, but whose influence shaped every aspect of their family's understanding of service and sacrifice. "He would be very proud, Misha, not just of your shooting, but of the person you're becoming." As the sun set behind the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that Mrs. Patterson's roses seemed to echo in their evening bloom, Maya Rodriguez reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. 11 bullets, 3 surgeries, years of physical therapy, decades of speaking engagements and testimony, and interviews designed to ensure the truth survived. But more than that, a husband who had waded through deployments and recovery and post-traumatic stress with patient love. A sister who had dedicated her medical career to healing wounds inflicted by warfare. A friend who had chosen to build bridges instead of walls, to connect communities instead of dividing them. And now a daughter who would grow up in a world where integrity was valued, where courage was rewarded, where telling the truth was seen as heroic rather than treasonous. Elena would face her own challenges, make her own choices about how to serve others, and what sacrifices were worth making. But she would face those challenges with the knowledge that her mother had survived 11 gunshots to prove that some principles were worth defending with your life. She would understand that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what was right, even when you were terrified. Maya Rodriguez, Medal of Honor recipient, survivor, mother, and guardian of military integrity, sat in her garden watching roses grow through impossible conditions and knowing that beauty and strength could flourish anywhere when their roots ran deep enough to find truth. 25 years later, the documentary 11 Bullets, the Maya Rodriguez story, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival to standing ovations and critical acclaim that would eventually earn it an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. Maya sat in the theater watching her life unfold on screen, seeing footage of the Fallujah pharmacy, hearing Tommy's recordings for the first time in years, witnessing the scope of corruption that her courage had exposed. Elena, now a West Point cadet in her final year, sat beside her mother, watching with the analytical eye of someone who understood military culture from the inside. Elena had chosen to follow the family tradition of service, but in a new form. She planned to become a military attorney, specializing in ethics violations and corruption cases. "Are you okay watching this?" Elena whispered during a particularly intense scene showing Maya's medical evacuation from Fallujah. Maya nodded, surprised to discover that the images no longer triggered the flashbacks and anxiety that had haunted her for years after the incident. Time and therapy, and the knowledge that her sacrifice had prevented countless other tragedies, had finally given her peace with her past. The documentary included interviews with soldiers whose lives had been saved by the weapons transfer investigation, families who had been reunited because corruption had been exposed and eliminated, young officers who had graduated from the Maya Rodriguez Institute for Military Ethics and carried those lessons into leadership positions around the world. Tommy appeared on screen, now graying but still energetic, standing beside the Golden Gate Bridge and explaining how his engineering career had been shaped by his experience in Fallujah. "Maya taught me that some things are worth building," he said to the camera, "and some things are worth tearing down. The trick is knowing the difference." Carmen's interview was conducted in her trauma surgery unit, where she was preparing for another complex operation on a wounded veteran. "My sister showed me what real courage looks like," Carmen said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what's right, even when you're terrified. Every surgery I perform is an act of courage inspired by her example." The film's final scene showed Maya at Arlington National Cemetery, placing roses on the graves of soldiers who had died from weapons that should never have been in enemy hands. Her voiceover reflected on the nature of heroism and the responsibility that came with survival. "People call me a hero for getting shot 11 times, Maya's voice said as the camera panned across the white headstones stretching toward the horizon. "But the real heroes are the ones who chose to tell the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent." Tommy Chen, who stayed to record evidence when he could have saved himself. Carmen Rodriguez, who dedicated her life to healing wounds inflicted by warfare. Every graduate of our Ethics Institute who chooses integrity over advancement. They are the ones who prove that courage is contagious, that one person's refusal to surrender principles can inspire generations to choose what's right over what's easy. The credits rolled to thunderous applause, and Maya found herself surrounded by filmmakers, critics, and audience members who wanted to shake her hand and express their gratitude for her service and sacrifice. But the person whose opinion mattered most was Elena, whose eyes reflected pride and understanding that hadn't been there before. "Mom," Elena said quietly as they walked through the festival crowds, "I finally understand why you wake up every morning and choose to keep fighting. It's not about the past anymore. It's about the future we're building for people we'll never meet." Maya squeezed her daughter's hand, thinking about the 25-year journey from that pharmacy in Fallujah to this moment of recognition and remembrance. The physical scars had faded, the psychological wounds had healed, but the responsibility remained constant, to ensure that her experience served as both warning and inspiration for future generations. 30 years later, General Elena Rodriguez stood at the podium of the United Nations General Assembly, wearing the 4 stars she had earned through 3 decades of distinguished service and moral leadership. As the newly appointed U.S. ambassador to the UN, Elena's first address focused on international cooperation in combating military corruption and weapons trafficking. 30 years ago, Elena began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through competence and integrity. "My mother survived 11 gunshots in Fallujah, Iraq, while exposing a conspiracy that was selling American weapons to the very insurgents killing American soldiers. That experience taught our family that corruption is not a political issue or a national issue. It is a human issue that threatens the security and dignity of people everywhere." In the audience, Maya sat with David, both now in their 70s but still sharp and engaged with the world their daughter was helping to shape. Maya wore a simple black dress and the Medal of Honor, as she had for every significant moment in Elena's career: graduation from West Point, promotion to colonel, appointment as general, and now this historic address to the world's diplomatic community. Elena's speech outlined a comprehensive international framework for monitoring weapons transfers, sharing intelligence about corruption, and coordinating responses to military misconduct that crossed national boundaries. The proposal had been developed over years of collaboration with allies who understood that military integrity was essential to global security. My mother's courage in 1999 prevented countless deaths by exposing weapons transfers that violated every principle of military honor, Elena continued. But individual courage is not enough. We need institutional reforms, international cooperation, and systemic changes that make corruption impossible rather than merely punishable. Maya listened with pride and amazement as her daughter outlined proposals that would have seemed impossible 3 decades earlier. Elena was operating at levels of power and influence that Maya had never imagined possible, using that influence to institutionalize the principles Maya had defended with her life in a Fallujah pharmacy. After the speech, Elena joined her parents for dinner at a small restaurant near the UN building, where they could speak privately about family matters rather than international affairs. Elena had never married, dedicating herself entirely to military service and the advancement of ethical leadership within military institutions worldwide. "Do you ever regret not having a family of your own?" Maya asked gently, a question she'd been wanting to ask for years but had never found the right moment. Elena considered the question carefully as she considered everything in her life. "Mom, I have a family. I have you and Dad, Uncle Tommy and Aunt Carmen, and thousands of officers who've graduated from the institute you founded. I have soldiers, around the world, who serve with integrity because of principles you established. That's a pretty substantial family." David raised his glass of wine in a toast to the Rodriguez family tradition of service, sacrifice, and stubborn refusal to accept injustice. Maya and Elena clinked their glasses against his, and for a moment they were just a family celebrating another milestone in a journey that had begun with bullets and blood, but had evolved into something much larger and more beautiful. Maya thought about Mrs. Patterson's roses, now growing wild across entire hillsides in Colorado, spreading beyond any garden boundaries and proving that beauty could flourish anywhere when it found the right conditions. Elena's career, Tommy's bridges, Carmen's surgeries, the Ethics Institute, the International Cooperation Framework. All of these were roses growing through concrete, proving that individual acts of courage could bloom into institutional changes that lasted generations. 35 years later, Maya Rodriguez died peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday morning in spring, surrounded by David, Elena, Tommy, Carmen, and 2 generations of young people whose lives had been shaped by her example. She was 78 years old and had lived to see corruption prosecutions in 14 countries, international cooperation agreements that prevented weapons trafficking, and military ethics standards that had become models for armed forces worldwide. Her funeral was held at the Maya Rodriguez Institute for Military Ethics, with representatives from 50 nations attending to pay their respects to a woman whose courage had transcended national boundaries and political affiliations. The service was conducted according to her wishes, simple, focused on service rather than celebrity, emphasizing the continuing work rather than past achievements. Elena delivered the eulogy, speaking not as a general or diplomat, but as a daughter who had learned everything important from watching her mother choose integrity over safety, truth over convenience, courage over comfort. Maya Rodriguez was shot 11 times in Fallujah because she refused to let corruption flourish in darkness, Elena said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. She spent the rest of her life proving that individual courage could inspire institutional change, that one person's refusal to surrender principles could transform the world. Tommy, now 75 and retired from active engineering but still consulting on bridge projects in developing countries, spoke about the friendship that had sustained him through decades of building connections between communities. "Maya taught me that some things are worth building and some things are worth tearing down. But most importantly, she taught me that the strongest structures are built on foundations of truth and integrity." Carmen, at 73, still performing complex trauma surgeries and training young doctors in her techniques, reflected on a medical career inspired by her sister's example. "Maya showed me that healing is an act of courage, that choosing to repair rather than destroy requires the same bravery that she demonstrated in that Fallujah pharmacy. Every life I've saved is a continuation of her refusal to let corruption and violence have the final word." The service concluded with the reading of messages from world leaders, military officers, ethics scholars, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by Maya's story. President Chen, Tommy's younger brother, who had been inspired by his siblings' military service to pursue public office, declared that Maya Rodriguez Day would be observed annually as a national remembrance of the importance of moral courage in military service. But the most meaningful tribute came from the newest graduating class of the Maya Rodriguez Institute for Military Ethics. 200 young officers who had completed their training and were preparing to carry her principles into military service around the world. They stood in formation outside the chapel, saluting as Maya's casket was carried to Arlington National Cemetery, where she would be buried among the soldiers whose lives had been saved by her courage. Elena watched the ceremony with David, both of them understanding that Maya's death marked not an ending but a transition. The principles she had fought for, the institutions she had helped create, the examples she had set, all of these would continue long after her physical presence was gone. As the burial service concluded and the honor guard fired their ceremonial volleys, Elena noticed roses beginning to bloom along the hillside where Maya would rest. Wild roses growing through impossible conditions, proving that beauty and strength could flourish anywhere when watered with courage and fed with truth. David placed his hand on Elena's shoulder, and together they watched the sun set behind Arlington's white headstones, knowing that Maya Rodriguez had earned her place among the heroes who had given everything in service of principles larger than themselves. The story of the woman who survived 11 gunshots in Fallujah and used that survival to transform military ethics around the world was complete. But the legacy she had created, in her daughter's diplomatic career, in Tommy's bridges connecting communities, in Carmen's healing hands, in thousands of ethical military leaders, in international cooperation frameworks that prevented corruption, that legacy would continue growing, spreading like wild roses, proving that individual courage could bloom into institutional change that lasted forever. 50 years later, Dr. Maya Chen Rodriguez, Elena's adopted daughter and Tommy's granddaughter, stood before the United Nations Security Council as the newly appointed director of the International Military Ethics Monitoring Organization. At 35, she carried the combined legacy of two remarkable families, the Rodriguez tradition of military integrity and the Chen legacy of building connections between communities. 50 years ago, Maya began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had inherited both the responsibility and the inspiration of previous generations. Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez survived 11 gunshots in Fallujah while exposing corruption that was costing American lives. Today, thanks to the institutions she helped create and the principles she died defending, we can report that military corruption has decreased by 78% globally, weapons trafficking between military organizations has been reduced to isolated incidents, and ethical leadership training is now mandatory in armed forces across 93 nations. The Security Council chamber was silent, as Maya outlined achievements that would have seemed impossible in 1999. When a young staff sergeant had faced down private military contractors in a bombed-out pharmacy. International cooperation frameworks, real-time monitoring systems, whistleblower protection protocols, and ethical leadership standards had transformed military culture worldwide. The Maya Rodriguez protocols, as they had come to be known, were now integrated into military training programs from West Point to Sandhurst to officer academies in nations that hadn't existed when Maya first put on the uniform. Her story was taught as a case study in moral courage, but more importantly, her example had been institutionalized into systems that prevented corruption rather than merely punishing it after the fact. Maya thought about the great-grandmother she had never met, but whose influence shaped every aspect of her worldview. Elena had raised her with stories of Fallujah, photographs of Mrs. Patterson's impossible roses, recordings of Tommy's bridge dedication ceremonies, and annual visits to Carmen's trauma surgery unit. But Maya's own career had taken her beyond military service into international diplomacy and systems analysis, working to build global frameworks that could prevent the kind of corruption that had nearly killed her namesake. She had spent 15 years developing algorithms that could detect suspicious weapons transfers, establishing secure communication channels for military whistleblowers, and creating international legal mechanisms for prosecuting military corruption regardless of national boundaries. After the Security Council session, Maya walked through Central Park, thinking about the bridges her grandfather Tommy had built, and wondering what he would think of the virtual bridges she was constructing. Connections between nations, institutions, and individuals committed to ethical military service. Her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Carmen Rodriguez Kim, Carmen's daughter who had followed her mother into trauma surgery but specialized in treating psychological wounds inflicted by military corruption and betrayal. Just finished surgery on a colonel who blew the whistle on weapons trafficking in Eastern Europe. He's going to be fine, physically and psychologically. Great Aunt Maya's protocols worked exactly as designed. Maya smiled, thinking about the ripple effects of individual courage that had spread across generations and continents. Carmen Rodriguez Kim had never met the woman whose example had inspired her great-aunt's medical career. But she carried forward the same commitment to healing wounds inflicted by warfare and corruption. A second message came from Elena, now 85 and retired but still actively involved in international ethics organizations. Watched your Security Council presentation online. Maya would be proud. You're building the kind of world she dreamed about when she was bleeding in that pharmacy 50 years ago. Maya looked up at the New York skyline, thinking about all the structures that connected communities and all the institutions that protected integrity. Tommy's bridges, Carmen's surgical techniques, Elena's diplomatic frameworks, her own monitoring systems, all of these were part of a legacy that had begun with one woman's refusal to let corruption flourish in darkness. The sun was setting behind the city's towers, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that reminded Maya of the wild roses she had seen growing through concrete at Arlington National Cemetery. Beautiful and impossible and absolutely determined to flourish despite harsh conditions. Maya Rodriguez had survived 11 gunshots in Fallujah and used that survival to prove that individual courage could transform the world. 50 years later, that transformation was complete, institutionalized, and spreading like wild roses across every continent where people served in uniform. The woman who had refused to die quietly in a bombed-out pharmacy had created a legacy that would outlast nations, outlast wars, outlast everything except the eternal human capacity to choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, integrity over advancement. Maya Chen Rodriguez, inheritor of that legacy and architect of its future, walked through Central Park, knowing that some battles were won not by those who fought hardest, but by those who refused to surrender what they believed in, no matter the cost. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.